right, so first we're going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to kind of do a broader overview in the commentary section, and then we're actually going to talk about what's shaping up to be a massive corporate theft and formalization of corporate oligarchy that looks to be passing the Senate and probably the House as well, shortly to be sent to Trump's desk. But look, big picture, we are at a crossroads, and we need to actually decide not just whether or not we're going to have capitalism or a form of socialism, but really whether or not we're going to have capitalism or democracy. The best practitioners of capitalism, the people who arguably believed in it the most, the Keynesians understood it better, and the Keynesians had a rational response to it. But the people who looked at capitalism as a god that all other human values and systems should subordinate to, just as you see today, the lieutenant governor of Texas, we'll talk about in the postgame, suggesting that people should die to keep the economy going. Donald Trump having an anxiety attack, wanting people to go out to work to keep the economy going. Thomas Friedman, which we will also talk about in the postgame, giving you the upmarket version of you dying for Wall Street profits. And let's be very clear. There's no choice here. The choices are not isolate, save ourselves, be prudent in a pandemic, and listen to what every infectious disease specialist says, or take a giant risk and keep the economy going. The obvious path is give every single human being $2,000 a month, provide health care, massively intervene in public services, and subsidize and protect small businesses and all the other obvious steps. There's nothing difficult about this. The reason that we don't do that is because of something called the labor theory of value, for one. At the end of the day, Wall Street's hoarding of wealth and money, in all of private businesses and corporations' hoarding of wealth and money, is predicated on stealing part of your labor. In classical Marxist terminology, but again, just the truth of how power works, your hourly wage hides the relationship between you and your employer. What you are getting sucked out in terms of your surplus labor is what creates profit. They need you to be doing this. There's also a more relative and immediate political question. If rents are freezed, if moratoriums come into play, if there's debts are struck, if UBI is delivered along with healthcare and housing and other essential services and basics, then we can start to learn a bigger lesson about what is available in our societies today. Because as everybody knows, everything that was just ranted and whined about as supposedly being unrealizable because of its cost with Bernie Sanders is exceeded in a matter of days. So it's a political question, and it's a fundamental question about how capitalism works. And in order for capitalism to keep working like this, you need to hack at democracy. Hayek, Milton, von Mises, Trump, Friedman, Bloomberg, and Blankfein are not believers in real democracy. Some formally not, and some in only the most limited, narrow variety possible. If we had an actual responsive democracy, everybody would be at home in safety and material protection with no rent to pay. But we don't, because we subordinate democracy to capitalism. We need to graduate from capitalism and restore democracy, because there's two very clear choices here. There is an anti-egalitarian, authoritarian depravity, which we've already outlined in terms of talking about going back to work and this horrifying sacrifice of life for GDP. There's also Attorney General Bill Barr trying to sneak through a DOJ request suggesting that in times of quote unquote emergency, which are pretty often in today's world, that judges can keep people in pretrial detention indefinitely. That's a fundamental attack on habeas corpus. That is apartheid style stuff. ICE and immigration have been continuing their raids, terrorizing people at hospitals. And one absolutely obscene example, dressing up as doctors to go to someone's home, I had even read. Trump's response has, of course, been a disaster and has lurked between xenophobia, fear-mongering, magical thinking, some listening to Dr. Fauci, and now back to anxiety about his reelection. The right is prepared to use this for a corporate theft bill that we're going to talk about in a second, which looks to be set to pass, as well as another attack on our civil liberties. We need to center human needs here. The Democratic leadership is, of course, failing. They're not willing to use leverage. Nancy Pelosi will go down as maybe the least effective opposition leader in human history. And this is not just a question of politics here. We know that Nancy Pelosi is wealthy and corporate oriented and will not fight for poor and working people. But no politician worth their salt would ever not use leverage in a situation like this to make the executive pay. Polls indicate now steadily a majority of Americans approving of Trump's handling a crisis that he made a crisis by ignoring out of the gate. And that is a testament to the extraordinary failure of Democratic leadership, in particular Nancy Pelosi, and in particular, when he does show up to cough in his hands, Joe Biden. We need a Green New Deal. We need mutual aid, micro and macro organizing. We need every single person in mass industry to be worker cooperative owned or labor union cooperative base. Labor union representation on boards, like in a German model at the bare minimum. We can make a case for these provisions today and bring forms of them into being on a more or less permanent basis if we fight and if we're creative and if we make demands and organize at the local, state, national, and even global levels. We cannot afford a lackluster response like we did in 2008. There are two futures, capitalism or democracy, and we need to decide which side we're going to be on. You guys have anything to add to that? We'll get to the bailout in a second, but you guys, there's a lot there. Anything you guys want to add to that?
We're most certainly at a crossroads. People recognize that things need to be done. And I think, I'll talk about this a little bit more in the gem, but I think making very clear to people the way that these institutions and who they're reacting for right now should make it very clear that, the idea that we live in a democracy is fairly laughable. It's very clear that the government institutions, their first responsibility is to look out for corporations and the wealthy and not for the millions and millions of working class people who are really struggling right now. We need to be hitting that point, both in the kind of larger rhetorical place, but then also on the practical level too. That's where, as Michael was saying, hitting these local initiatives is going to be very important. This crisis is a global crisis, but a lot of the response is going to have to come from the local level, and being in the position to organize and to be the first people on the ground and shape the narrative and also shape the response is something that we really need to be prepared to do, and we need to be doing yesterday.
Absolutely.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.